explainer. If you've glanced at global news any time in the last few decades, you've absolutely seen a profound, ongoing struggle over one of the world's major religions. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating source text that attempts to define the true meaning of Islam and its critical role in peace building. Now, just to be clear right up front, this explainer isn't about taking sides. Instead, we're going to calmly and objectively unpack an analysis that looks right at the heart of this religion's core identity. Our source immediately grabs our attention by posing a huge provocative question. Is Islam a religion of violence or a religion of peace? Or, as the text pretty bluntly puts it, is there a deliberate conspiracy by certain factions to portray it strictly as a religion of force, terror, and blood? This isn't just some abstract philosophical debate, right? It's literally a high-stakes war over the core identity of a faith followed by billions of people. Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a highly structured roadmap laid out by our source. First, the battle for Islam's meaning. Then, the threat of global extremism, followed by a vision of true peace. Next, we'll hit 3 models of resilience, and finally, winning the ideological war. Let's get to it. Starting off with Section 1, the battle for Islam's meaning, clash versus coexistence. So, right now, there are 2 intensely competing narratives fighting for dominance. On one side, you have what the text calls the talk-fury view. This is basically an exclusionary extremist mindset built entirely around violence and clash. But on the exact opposite side sits the civil or Quranic view, and that is a pluralistic vision emphasizing mercy, cooperation, mutual understanding, and peace. These 2 visions are colliding right now. They're fighting a massive war to dictate exactly how the religion is understood and practiced across the entire globe. Which brings us right to Section 2, the threat of global extremism and the rise of terror networks. Let's see how this actually builds. To really understand the threat today, our source maps out how this exclusionary narrative turned into real-world violence over the decades. It kicks off in 1948 in Indonesia with the formation of a rigid group called Dar al-Islam, who aggressively demanded a religious government. Fast forward to the 1980s during the Afghan War. This was essentially the crucible, where local extremist groups from all over met up, merged, and franchised into massive cross-border terror networks, like Al-Qaeda. By 2000 and 2002, this evolved global network was executing totally devastating operations, like the infamous bombings in Bali, Indonesia. And the thing is, these groups don't just attack at random. They deliberately target the very pillars of societal coexistence. They specifically go after churches, Christian minorities, and local economies. Why? Well, according to our source, their ultimate goal is a psychological strategy to completely eradicate pluralism. They want to create a void, right? A void they can then fill with their own coercive, mandatory authority. Now, let's shift gears to Section 3, a vision of true peace and reclaiming Islam. To counter all this global terror, a really powerful ideological solution is starting to emerge. Take, for example, the Message of Peace International Foundation. According to our text, this foundation, which is spearheaded by prominent thinker and author Ali Mohammed Al-Shurafa Al-Hammadi, represents a tangible institutional push for that pluralistic, peaceful vision we were just talking about earlier. Al-Shurafa's vision is essentially a robust ideological counterattack. He argues for completely reclaiming the faith from tech-fury violence by going strictly back to its original texts. He places a massive emphasis on the unity of all religious messages. In fact, he explicitly highlights how true Islam honors the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ. By validating these shared beliefs, his goal is to establish deep, unshakable roots for human coexistence, basically pulling the rug right out from under the extremists' foundation of hatred. This takes us right into Section 4, 3 models of resilience and state-level action. Because this philosophical battle isn't just theoretical, governments are actively fighting it. The text highlights Indonesia as a primary example of this kind of foundational resilience. Back in 1945, Indonesia established Pancasila as its constitutional philosophy. So instead of adopting that coercive religious model demanded by groups like Dar al-Islam, Indonesia deliberately chose to be a pluralistic, civil, and national state. This framework protects freedom, it supports the presence of religion without forcing it on anyone, and it actively nurtures a diverse civil society. And this brilliantly illustrates how different nations tackle the exact same overarching threat. Egypt, for instance, relied on direct armed confrontation, paying a heavy, heavy price in lives to protect its national sovereignty. Indonesia, as we just saw, focused heavily on dismantling complex cross-border terror networks while preserving its civil model. Meanwhile, the UAE took on the war of awareness. They actively worked on curbing hate speech, promoting a global culture of tolerance, and proving that ideological combat is absolutely just as essential as physical security. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, winning the ideological war, ideas versus ideas. Now, what's really interesting here is what happens when state action successfully combines with ideological reform. The scale of success can be absolutely staggering. Our source cites a massive prison rehabilitation program in Indonesia that ran from 2012 to 2016. Through intense intellectual work, dialogues, and debates overseen by state institutions, they achieved an unbelievable de-radicalization rate. Out of 3,000 participating extremist leaders and members, an astounding 2,750 were successfully rehabilitated back into a peaceful mindset. That is incredible. So what's the core takeaway here? Ultimately, we are fighting a war of awareness. Yes, military force and security are necessary, for sure, but there are simply not enough on their own to end the threat. Ideas literally have to be fought with new ideas, actively countering hate speech, spreading a unified narrative of tolerance, and intellectually dismantling extremist thought right at its root. That's the only sustainable way to actually stop the cycle of violence. Our source concludes this explainer with a pretty stark choice. The world really must learn from these resilient state models and fully embrace these reformist ideas of peace. Because if the global community fails to actively champion coexistence, we leave a very dangerous ideological void. And that void will inevitably be filled by extremism, terror, and bloodshed. It leaves us all with a critical, urgent question. Will we actively choose a future of coexistence? Or are we going to let the forces of division define tomorrow?
مؤسسة رسالة السلام العالمية، رسالة إنسانية لعالم أكثر سلاماً.